Welcome to our audience, the McCain Institute audience. My name is Paul Fagan. I am the director of the Human Rights and Democracy programs here at the McCain Institute, and I'm really pleased to host yet another conversation with a distinguished panel on the future of NATO, and with a focus on NATO and China. You know, I always have to say this in most of this conversation, since we are the McCain Institute. You know, Senator John McCain was a steadfast proponent of the transatlantic alliance, of the NATO alliance. No greater statesman really, talked about it as much and advocated as much as he did. And as we've seen in the past month with the war in Ukraine, he was right in his belief of a strong NATO, but also a strong Ukraine. As we are seeing, our partners, the United States, our European partners and others, around the support Ukraine's effort in this war against Russia. Today, though, we also shift from talking about Russia specifically to talking about China and how the war in Ukraine has affected NATO member states and their relationships with China. Whether this war has altered it, previous events have altered the relationship with China and NATO member states, and how China is being a wedge, or not so much a wedge, in the relationship of the alliance. And we have a great panel today to discuss all of this. As we just heard recently, today or yesterday, from the foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister Lavrov, Russian and Chinese relations have never been better. That's what they're saying. And we're going to unpack that today with our panelists. First, we have a good friend of the McCain Institute and a long friend of Senator John McCain. He's the former Lithuanian ambassador to the US, but he's also now a sitting member of the Lithuanian Seimas Parliament. He leads the Foreign Relations Committee. We have Žygimantas Paviljonis. Hope I got that right, Žygis.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jakub Yonda. He's the director of European Value Center for Security Policy based in Prague, Czech Republic. And finally, we have Bobo Lowe. He is a non-resident senior fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. He's also associated with the Lowy Institute in Australia. He's a former Australian diplomat based in Moscow, and has a tremendous amount of expertise in the Chinese-Russian relationship. So really excited to have all three of you join us today in this important conversation as we delve into this relationship of China and NATO, but also how this war in Ukraine really has impacted all of that. I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to provide us with some opening statements about their feelings on this topic, and we're going to start off with Žygis. So Žygis, we're going to turn it over to you in Lithuania.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you. This is today 18th anniversary exactly of our NATO membership. That would never happened without support of late Senator McCain, our American friends, and our Czech friends, because you did it in Prague NATO Summit in 2002. Then it was the historic visit of President Bush to Lithuania that we all remember. And he said then that from this day, every enemy of Lithuania is automatically the enemy of the United States. So it was a wonderful period. I would say Baltic dreams were come through, because Americans and Europeans knew, they had the strategies. They knew where they go. Unfortunately, after our enlargement for last more or less 2 decades, we went into the period of appeasing dictatorships in Kremlin and in China. We were thinking that we live in the era of Fukuyama. We were investing into creating, interdependencies with those autocracies, thinking that with money we will, make them European or American. It was so wrong. We empowered the dictators who finally started, they killed the democracy inside and started to send tanks over the border. I still remember Georgia-Russia war. Instead of punishing Putin, we embraced him with wonderful reset. And I still remember my meetings with Senator McCain. I was shocked how stupid and naive it could be to empower the dictator after conquering part of the nation, and we called it Munich's of 21st century. It continued. Nobody believed us. Already in 2008, we said, next will be Ukraine. So, guys were thinking that we're crazy. So after everything that happened, and you know what happened, I think we are coming back to this Lithuanian Czech understanding or Baltic Czech understanding of the realities. We name things as they are. We finally understand that democracy has to be defended. And instead of putting all the money on autocracies, we understand that we have to cut all those ties. We have to empower us, democracies, from Ukraine to Taiwan. We have to stand for each other and defend each other, because if Russians are winning that war in Ukraine, China will learn its lesson, and it will be the end of liberal democracy. So today we have to be, back on blocks, defending democracy, extending NATO. I'm just back from Stockholm to Sweden and Finland, because they will ask for it. Do it with Ukraine, because if everybody will be listening to Lithuanians in Bucharest NATO summit, nothing would happen, nothing. Together with President Bush and 7 countries, we've been lobbying for it. We were blocked by Germans and French, and see the results now. Not only NATO enlargement, also EU enlargement to Ukraine. Let's do it. We did it together. We have to make that red line very, very clear. And we have to really rethink international organization, or instrumentarium we have, because just read the UN Charter, read it now carefully. Oh my God, it's everything we cherish in Lithuania or Czech Republic or America, and it has nothing to do with Security Council, because you have dictatorships in Security Council that are distorting the world order, that are willing to kill the liberal democracy on the map. We have to push them out from those organizations and create organizations that fight for democracy. We have to create special forces of democracy. I like that idea of democracy summit, but does they have some instrument? We recently, had to say goodbye to Secretary Albright. I still remember her coming to my embassy and saying, Žygis, let's fight for community of democracies. Yeah, and it's organization without teeth. I still remember, and I will finish on that, Mark Palmer coming to my embassy. He was a speechwriter of Reagan Westminster speech, and he said his last toast in my embassy was, Žygis, let's create the world where autocracies will be banned by international law. I was shocked with his statement, but honestly, I think he was completely right. I will finish on that radical statement.
Well, thank you, Žygis, and I think your radical statement is something to really talk about and to consider these days. I think the world has changed in the last month, and so I want to talk to Jakub and give you a few minutes for your opening remarks and kind of get a perspective from our Central European partners.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the McCain Institute for having me. So I'll try to put it in basically bullet point arguments. I would say that where we are now, more than a month into the major Russian war in Ukraine, it's a good and important mirror to all of us. In a sense, over the last 4 or 5 weeks, if you look over practical actions of individual countries globally, you see who they are. And you see how they respond to crisis, because I think many wise people say, look, crisis does not change people; it only shows who you are. And I'm afraid this is what we can see it very clearly now. And so that's the mirror we are seeing. And we could see, if you look across European map, and we see it from Vilnius or from Prague as well, we see that most of countries in Central and Eastern Europe are really helping Ukraine as much as possible, with the exception of Hungary, which is under Viktor Orban, basically playing a role of a friend of Russia, which pretends not to be in NATO. But outside of Hungary, I have to say that most Central and Eastern European countries are doing a lot on the military assistance level or on the humanitarian response as well. There's so many things happening, even from countries which we are not huge countries, in Central Eastern Europe, with some exceptions. And we are doing a lot if you compare it to what many of countries like Germany, Italy, or France are doing in material sense of things which are coming to Ukraine physically over the last 4 or 5 weeks. You could see what Central Europe is, and what many of our friends in Western Europe are saying nice things, but doing very little. And that is what is my big concern, honestly. Because what matters is what we do in Ukraine now, and the time is actually now. So that's the mirror argument, let's say, and the mirror argument I would use also for China, because if you look over what China has been doing with Russia, we've been having a lot of important policy discussions inside the Western European circles over what's the relationship really between Russia and China and the leaderships. And that's something what we will need to study in the future, because basically this axis of evil, which is there, we could call it different names, but we could see what they do. And in practical terms, we see a lot of economic, or you could even say sometimes financial cooperation between Russia and China. They have disagreements between each other. That's always how it works with dictatorships teaming up, if you look over our history, but still they have the same goal, and that's pushing back against the US and anybody who is a friend or an ally of the United States. And that's what they see in Ukraine as well. So I think for us collectively, the big question is, I mean, obviously now it's all about punishing and pushing back against Russia, because Russia is actually slaughtering people on a daily basis in Ukraine now. But after this is over, our big question is, what was the role of China into this? Because a couple of weeks ago, we saw China signing a huge economic deals with Russia. So far, we actually see China not pushing back hard against Russia. We could say, okay, China is not fully supporting Russia. I honestly don't think that's enough. I mean, we are not talking about symbolic actions. We are talking about thousands of people dying in Ukraine because of what Russia does. So my question, and our question collectively, is how is China stopping it? And China is not stopping it. China is maybe not fully supporting it publicly because they cannot do it. That would be too harmful strategically for them. But if you look at the economic relationship, that's what's happening. So the next question for the future, for upcoming weeks and months, is how much of financial or economic support will there be from China to Russia? How much will China help Russia to at least to some level survive the Western sanctions, which are very hard as been put on Russia? So that's clearly, I think, the big question for us. Then maybe another question would be, what happens after the war, the kinetic war is over in Ukraine? Will China come with bags of money to Ukraine, promising to pay for its restoration? I would expect that to happen. There are many people in European capitals who expect China to try. And given how we have seen Chinese actions inside Ukraine before this escalation, I would expect China that to be tried. And Ukraine will need a lot of money for its reconstruction, because the damages are huge, I'm afraid. So that's a big question we need to prepare for. I'm not blaming our Ukrainian friends. They are fighting for survival, and in the future they'll be fighting for rebuilding their country in a similar sense like after the World War. So given the scope of the damages in individual places in Ukraine, so it will be a big question for us. Then my next argument would be, I mean, the level of Western sanctions put on Russia is actually very unprecedented. I think it's very good. Even we have Western democracies push each other to do it. Even countries like Germany and France did not veto it this time, which is good. At least most of the packages. So this is good, and I think China pays attention, because this is. I'm positively surprised by the level of the sanctions we have put on Russia. I would be more skeptical if somebody told me this before. So that's good news for us. And we need to see that China understands that this is how the Western world reacts to such a major slaughter. Not only the military action, but also the whole attack. Then to finish up, I think we clearly see that those two theaters, if you put it that way, meaning Southeast Asia and potential Chinese attack on Taiwan and the current Russian attack in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, those things are connected. Not only because those bad actors are connected, like Russia and China, with their various level of relationship, but for us, and that's why you see Lithuania starting having such a strong connection and relationship with Taiwan. That's why I would say Czech Republic is trying to follow what Lithuania does now. At least we are trying to push for it as much as possible. And this is the future. This is what we should be doing. Even as smaller countries, we need to team up and help each other where we can. And some people would, like a month ago, some people in Central Europe would tell you, look, there is nothing substantial between Taiwan and Central European countries. And now my team is actually doing a lot of closed door briefings for Taiwanese governments and military officials, because they are very interested over how is Ukraine defending itself on the tactical military level. What are the lessons for defense of Taiwan? What are the things that countries like Lithuania, Estonia, Sweden, Finland, those countries which prepare their population, how much we could learn from our Eastern European region, Central Eastern European region, into how Taiwan can defend itself in the future and deter possible Chinese aggression. So that's why our team is actually setting our own office as a think tank in Taipei. And last question I would or last point I would put on the table. Now, in many Western capitals, there are discussions over what are the Russian interests and how Russian state interests, and how can we hurt them so we make it painful for Russia to continue the invasion. We need to have a same discussion on China, not because China would be doing the same thing now, but we need to make sure that the Chinese leadership understands that there will be Western capitals, or let's say not only European and American, but let's say democratic capitals, who will have list of Chinese interests in their own countries ready to be damaged if China actually does something against Taiwan. Because that's deterrence, that's preemptive deterrence. We need to make sure China understands we are willing to do it. I'm not sure we are willing to do it at this moment on China, and we need to get there. And that's a discussion we should need to be having, because we now see on Ukraine how much it's needed and how much it helps actually to stop or deter a future more further aggression. Sorry for being long.
No. Jakob, I think you raised a lot of great points and open-ended questions that I know we won't be able to, tackle in this one discussion, but certainly the future of the relationship with China is really important, especially from NATO member states and states around the world. We are watching what China is doing and how they're reacting. But I'd love to turn to Bobo to get his reaction, but also just his points out there about this Russian-Chinese relationship. Bobo, over to you. Thank you.
Paul, thanks very much. And thank you to the McCain Institute for inviting me onto such an interesting and distinguished panel. And my opening remarks follow naturally from Jakub's. So, Paul, you mentioned earlier about Lavrov saying that the Sino-Russian relationship is better than it's ever been. For once, he's not telling a fib. He is absolutely right. The relationship is better than it's ever been in the two countries' history. However, I think we need to take a bit of a reality check here. This is not an alliance. It is, in my view, a classic great power partnership that's based on common interests rather than necessarily shared values. Now, Jakub is right. I mean, certainly China and Russia agree on the undesirability of a dominant America, of a US-led liberal order. Yet, I think it's also important to emphasize that China and Russia are strategically autonomous actors, and they in fact have rather different approaches and attitudes towards international order. Beijing is what I would call a system player. It games the international system from within. It exploits the system's advantages, but also the system's shortcomings. Moscow, in stark contrast, is what I'd call a system disruptor. It has a vested interest in a fluid and unstable international environment. In fact, its attitude really is the worse things are in the world, the better it is for Russian interests. So this means that China and Russia, although they agree on much, they do not operate as a coordinated force in international affairs. And in fact, they have very little influence on each other's decision-making. So taking the case of the war in Ukraine, yes, Putin probably told Xi Jinping that in their February the 4th summit that Russia would go in. But he would have probably also have told Xi Jinping that it's going to be a walk in the park. Ukrainian resistance will be minimal. The West will wring its hands as per usual. There'll be a few extra sanctions, but we'll ride it out. And basically the world and the West will be confronted with a new reality to which they would necessarily have to adapt. And since Beijing couldn't exactly stop Moscow from this action, he's thinking, well, fine, let it go. But for Beijing, the war in Ukraine has unfolded in the worst possible way. Ukrainian resistance has been highly effective. The Russian military has performed disastrously. The Western reaction has been far stronger, more united than anyone, and certainly Beijing, anticipated. Putin has been humiliated at a personal as well as political level, and transatlantic unity and the idea of the West has received a new lease of life. Now, for Beijing, the longer the war continues, the more difficult its position becomes, because it's struggling to balance, on the one hand, the Sino-Russian partnership with, on the other hand, its relations with the West. And the very real danger from Beijing's perspective is that it could end up alienating everyone. Crucially, China is far more integrated into the global economy than Russia, and therefore has even more to lose than Russia from things going pear-shaped for Putin in Ukraine. Now, Beijing hopes that moral and political support for Putin will satisfy him, and that the West will also view such backing for Russia as essentially symbolic and therefore not subject to punishable by sanctions. But the thing is, Beijing is in a real jam here. It has minimal capacity to moderate Putin's behavior. And what's more, it's risky even to try, because for Beijing understands that for Putin, Ukraine is just as much a core interest as Taiwan is for China. The problem here, from Beijing's perspective, is that the Sino-Russian partnership, along with its many advantages, currently associates China with an increasingly delinquent and, even more important, failing actor. But the trouble is, if China distances itself from Russia, it could become geopolitically isolated. So in the current circumstances, there are no good options for Beijing. It's trying to straddle two horses, but this is highly unlikely to be sustainable in the long term. Now, just a quick word on Taiwan. The effectiveness of the Ukrainian resistance and the unity of the West, I think, make it less likely that Beijing will contemplate a forcible reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. Because ultimately, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an anti-model of how an authoritarian power should prosecute its strategic interests. And I'll leave it there, and we can go into a discussion of other things.
Yep. Oh, but those are great. That's a great way to kind of, characterize that relationship and that sort of the future of the relationship. But I want to go now to some questions for all of you, and I'm going to start with you, Zigis. Everyone kind of talked about a little bit about this, but I want to unpack this, the Baltic relationship with Russia and standing up to be a myth and continuing to, I would say, win. Russia and Putin better than any other country in the world. You and your Baltic neighbors, you're on the front lines. You've been, fighting a mis and disinformation war for years and somehow succeeded. And now you are, Lithuania has risen, I would say risen up, but also challenged China in its hegemony, when it also comes to Taiwan. I wanted, sort of the audience to know more about what's going on with Lithuania and, how it continues to stand up to Russia successfully, but also challenging China these days as a small nation, but also having an impact and leading other countries, maybe even the Czech Republic and other smaller nations, to do something similar.
Okay, I will try to explain it and maybe to compare it with the Ukrainian situation, and then, of course, make those links to China and Taiwan. Look, we were first to revolt against the Soviets. I still remember Gorbachev was coming to Vilnius and begging, please, stay with us. We will do something. Clarity, truth, don't be afraid. We heard those phrases, this big statement of John Paul II. Truth, it is exactly what those dictators are so much afraid. if, you need to be very clear in your strategy. We said, Gorbachev, we hate your, slogans. We need independence and freedom now. Forget about Soviet Union. Well, he sent tanks. They killed my friends from my own school. I saw it. Then it was more than clear for me. Goodbye, my love, EU and NATO. No more compromises. And, the West was also very clear with us. EU in 93 in Copenhagen European Council said, well, actually, that was because of Karel Bildt team. He negotiated it. Free trade agreements with the Baltics will lead to association, and that might lead to membership in European Union. The West said it in 93 for us. The West didn't say it to Ukraine in association agreements, not at all. The West said the same, Albright and all other wonderful leaders. Well, okay, starting even from Reagan, and Bush, they said clearly Baltics will be part of NATO. When you draw that red line to Russians, hope they retreat. They are so much afraid of Americans. Like all those sociopaths, they are really afraid of real stuff. They're going just and grabbing and killing the weakest. So there is no clarity with Ukraine and all other territories. And I would say the same on Taiwan. If you leave those territories in gray zone only, if you are not clear, and we are not clear, tell me, explain me, will Ukraine be part of the West or not? We don't know. So if you don't know, it's an invitation to occupy. And we felt it in Bucharest in 2008. We thought this is the beginning of the war. Invitation for the war, Georgia and Ukraine, done. We felt it. The West didn't believe us. So make it very clear. Ukraine will be part of EU, grant candidate status, start accession talks. It might continue, but we will fix it all. Why do we, and it will be kind of safe way to spend money inside the family with all the control mechanisms, and we will heal that body. Don't worry. The same on NATO. Be very clear, and be very clear with Putin. Why do you waste money on this war criminal, killer, who is destroying us all? Putin regime should go. State it like Biden said. Foreign minister, my foreign minister just repeated. This is the beginning of the end of Putin. Let's fight for Russian democracy. Why do we abandon them? Why did we sell them for all the contracts and all wonderful business contracts? No, let's fight for Europe whole and free. And if Putin falls, can you imagine what kind of fourth way of democratization will start in this part of Europe? If you read Huntington, it will be exactly like this. We are living in the era of Huntington. It's not Fukuyama, sorry. So be very clear. And finally, be very clear with China and Taiwan. If you don't want to see what is now happening in Ukraine, make it clear. It's Taiwan. Name it like we name it. We expect it to be done in Prague. We expect it to be done on the Hill. We expect it to be done in every capital. Because if you continue with this ambiguity, ambiguity is taken by a dictatorship like weakness. You are weak. We can, in those who know Russian communists, they had a saying, I will repeat that Russian strange saying, "Прощупывать Европу штыками." You have knife, and you just check where are the borders of Europe. If you don't meet bone, you just grab it. Who noticed that Belarus is occupied? Nobody, because there is no bone. So be the bone, make it very clear. And I'm not so good in Taiwanese, affairs like all other panelists, but I would just recognize the freedom. I would just make diplomatic recognitions and make it very, very clear. If I would be Taiwanese foreign minister, I would fight for it now, because in 2, 3, 4 years, it might be later. And the same with those stupid, enslaving formats like, okay, now it's 16+1 because we left that format. Kill it now. It's devised to divide us, first of all, from Americans, and then from the rest of Europe. and slowly and kind of occupy in different strategic infrastructures. Why do we need it? It's killing us. So get rid of it in Prague, in all other capitals, and recreate EU formats. Let's do common formats. Let's install those anti-coercion mechanisms that when China is bullying next time, another Lithuania, we are retaliating at EU level. Let's defend it. So, let's fight for democracy. It's time to wake up. It's time to get rid of ambiguities. It's time of strategic visions that are clear, because strategy will be implemented only then it is clear to everyone. There is no clarity. There are no leaders like McCain or Reagan today. So let's invent them. Let's empower what Biden says. Let's find new leaders in our capitals. And first of all, listen to us. We are like litmus tests, like Carl Bildt was calling us in 94. Hear what we say, because we are living on the border, and those guys are trying to kill us. But we know how to build the resilience, but we need coalitions, and we need your strength. I will finish with Baltic wishes. Last thing, we need Americans in. We need permanent presence of American troops in the Baltics. In Poland, you have 10,000 Americans. In Lithuania, you have 300 rotating Americans that sometimes just disappear for vacations, And vacations are usually used by Russians to kind of tourism, and we don't want this kind of tourism. Please stop it with American troops permanently present in the Baltics. And McCain would do it. Thank you.
Yes, I think you're right. McCain would probably do much of what you said. Let me pick up and then ask Jakub a question about this issue of NATO resilience, European resilience, and in collaboration on this issue of China and the wedge issue. China, Russia, they've been somewhat successful in wedging issues with European, with Europeans. Some European countries are I want to say pro-China or have a different relationship than others within the EU. But how has this war really changed in your opinion, a place like Czech Republic and others in the EU and NATO with their relationship with China?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Czech relationship with China is very negative over the last 2-3 years. So given the Czech, some of the Czech actions on Taiwan previously by level of our local politicians like Mayor of Prague or opposition figures like the Speaker of the Czech Senate. But now we have a new government which came to power just before Christmas. And the centralized government in Prague actually openly supports Taiwan. So the government's policy program openly says that we plan, Czech Republic will deepen its relationship with Taiwan and similar things. And there is also an ongoing review of the Czech-China policy, which is important because starting in July, for half a year, Czech Republic will be presiding over the European Union, which I think will give us a good voice. Obviously, much of the presidency will be about Russia and Ukraine, but I think there are plans to discuss. I mean, we call it the Indo-Pacific, but overall, it's all about China, as we know, so that will be positive. Overall, we see a lot of starting of, for example, security cooperation between Taiwan and Czech institutions as well. Some exchanges, some plans I can't really disclose yet, but some things are starting, which is good. So we have the political and economic relationship between Czech Republic and Taiwan is also translating into security relationship, which is something what I think we should be doing all, because we face similar issues, be it Russian and Chinese cyber operations, be it technical cyber or cognitive warfare operations. We face similar threats, even though we are geographically far away between Taiwan and Czech Republic, 9,000 kilometers, but still we face many things together. But on China, I mean, if you put it in a simplified words, China came to Central Europe, including Czech Republic, around 2014-15, promising huge investment. It never came. We only got increase in Chinese espionage. We got increase in Chinese harassment of Czech institutions, not only Czech ones, but in overall in Central Europe. the only people benefiting from Chinese involvement in Central Europe is Viktor Orban and his oligarchs. Outside of that, you don't see many institutions or individuals really benefiting as a whole states in Central Europe. So there's a huge dissatisfaction over the last 2-3 years over, first, the Chinese investment basically never came to Central Europe compared to the promises. Second, we have an increase in Chinese harassment, sometimes very open and very direct blackmail like China to Lithuania now, or milder versions against Sweden or Czech Republic in recent years. And if you look over societal attitudes, if you look over polls in Central Eastern Europe, basically everybody hates China as on the level of populations. I'm making it simpler than it is, but if you look over the numbers, it's like 60 to 80% of populations in most of Central Eastern European countries, according to Eurobarometer, which see China negatively. There are various reasons for it, but China has very little chance on the level of populations. So the only chance China has is to bribe their way into the political establishment, which China is very good at doing in individual countries, or more importantly, actually create business dependence between specific large companies. We had one in Prague called PPF. There are many German big companies doing similar things, which then become the best lobbyists or best advocates for soft policy on China of their own governments. And that's what we have seen in Germany, France, Italy, I mean, in my own country, Czech Republic as well in recent years. And that's the main problem of our, meaning European relationships with China, that there are big businesses basically on the Chinese side who are formally our citizen, but in fact they are lobbying for China. It's changing now, but that's the core of our problem, because otherwise, if you look just technically, or let's say technically looking at what China is to Europeans, it's a totalitarian dictatorship which is conducting genocide, threatening everybody, being pretty bad at everybody, very hostile. So it looks that there are no good reasons why we should have a positive relationship with China at every level. But there is this level of some business interests of in some of the European countries, which is holding back our response. And that's been the case in recent years, not only now. So that's the main focus, or should be, I think, our main focus on getting rid of these dependencies, or at least making them transparent. Because quite often, at least I would call it a joke, but it's a sad joke in many European capitals, is that, you know, who decides on European China policy? It's Volkswagen, it's some of the German chemical companies. I mean, they don't decide. Their voice is so strong in Berlin that there are many European governments who know many things will not go through because specific German companies don't want them to happen. And I think that's a horrible, undemocratic problem. And it comes under the spotlight finally now, which is good. And also thanks to the fact that many of those German companies actually pressure the German government and also the Lithuanian government to change their Taiwan policy, which is horrifying, honestly, because China is attacking the internal market of the EU, not only by attacking Lithuania, but also pressuring German companies. And the response of for example, German government is not to go hard against China, stop doing this to us, but pressuring Lithuanian government as it did happen. Maybe it gets better now, but this is what we cannot do to each other as allies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you brought up about, you know, the private sector playing an oversized role in our relationships with China. Obviously, that's a big issue here in the United States with our relation, you know, our massive companies' investments in China. And the integration of our economies, and not holding China accountable for its genocide against the Uyghurs, you know, continued oppression of Tibetans and other minorities, but also just Chinese in general, have such a lack of freedoms. And I want to come back to that, but I want to, you know, bring Bobo back into this conversation about some like core issues that I think we just would love to kind of continue to unpack. About the Russia, you know, China relationship, and you know, you mentioned it. We talked about Lavrov saying the relationship has never been better, and probably has been, but China doesn't act, it acts on its own self-interest, not on Russia's part, right? We see the Belt and Road Initiative around the world. Certainly, you know, China has a much more pragmatic relationship with countries around the world than Russia does, where I see Russia as more of a spoiler. And it's whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya, Central African Republic, Venezuela, and other places. So is China willing to enhance its relationships with Russia at the cost of Western relationships? Are they willing to get rid of the albatross? Because the heavier Russia becomes, it could actually bring down China in its relationships with the West and in other countries.
The difficulty that the Chinese have is, well, I mean, essentially what they want is the best of all worlds. So they value the Sino-Russian partnership, but they also recognize that China has been the single greatest beneficiary of the post-Cold War order over the last 3 decades. So the question is, how can they keep the good times rolling, so to speak? And that's very, very difficult, because I think people have got wise to Chinese tactics, Chinese strategy. And the worst thing from a Chinese perspective is this equating them with Russia. And yet the Chinese would argue, look, we haven't fought a war since 1979, whereas Russia fights multiple wars. And the thing is, the Chinese have multiple means of projecting power, whereas Russia essentially has 2, energy and military means, and the energy weapon is devaluing sharply. So the thing is, what China would like to keep doing, in my view, is continue working within the existing international system. I think a lot of people are under the misconception that China and Russia want a new world order. I think Russia wants an old world order, like Yalta 1945. But China is actually relatively content with the existing world order, but rather seeks to maximize its influence within that order. So, in other words, it doesn't want a US-dominated war order. It wants to have a role that's at least equivalent to that of the United States in an international order. It wants an international order that continues to allow it to exploit its advantages and also limitations. And frankly, the current international order has been pretty good for China, and it would like the good times to keep continuing. But the trouble is, it is hitched with this delinquent partner whose behavior makes a mockery of the international order. And so there's a huge embarrassment factor. So how do you manage a partner who won't listen to you anyway, who won't show the necessary degree of restraint? And yet, how do you avoid the reputational damage? I think that's really difficult for China. I mean, I know it sounds like I'm feeling sorry for Beijing. Really, I'm not. I'm just trying to present a problem that they face. They haven't, contrary to what people suppose, they cannot really significantly influence Russian behavior. And yet they are tainted by association. So that is really difficult. I'll leave it there, but I mean, there are several issues arising from that.
Jakob and then Jigis, I think you want to respond to some of the things that Bobo said. Yeah,
I fully agree with Bobo. I think for China, it will be very hard, because China has various conflicting interests. Because what will happen now is that the Russian economy or Russian state de facto will be hit very hard by the sanctions they have on them. We'll see how they survive it, how they will change, how it will change internally within Russia, the state structures, the social structures as well. Effectively, what will happen is Russia is going to the direction of like a large European North Korea, in a sense of isolation. Not full North Korea, that's impossible given the size of Russia, but in information isolation, some level, most of the level of economic isolation as well, political one, reputational one as well. This is where Russia is going. And that means that China cannot associate itself with Russia openly. But the big question is, how long will China wait? In a sense that I would say the value of Chinese money or Chinese financial support to Russia will be increasing over time, because Russia will be left with no good source of funding, of money for itself outside of some small revenues in upcoming years, given the sanctions, given the energy transformation as well. So Russia will be really, really struggling. meaning that those willing to support financially inside Russia will have high value, meaning that China will be able to buy a lot of political influence inside Russia if it wants, and over time. Which again will be very tricky for China, because China will be, as we said, will be seen as the friend, supporter, whatever, funder of Russia. We might see like kind of quid pro quo, for example, because Russia is a de facto state sponsor of terrorism at this moment, and not only in Ukraine, although in other places. So we could see, for example, I mean, Russia could do very hostile actions in African countries, for example, on behalf of China, without the direct association, with the deniability where China will be saying, look, we have, that wasn't us, it was the crazy Russians, but de facto there will be some quid pro quo for Chinese money. That's something what we could expect. I'm not saying it will happen on full scale, but that will be hard for China to keep this kind of relationship. But at the same time, I think it is tempting, because there are things inside Russia which China would like to buy in the future, but it will not be easy for international reputation and also for some practicalities, because it's easy to buy oligarchs, but the whole Russian system is not only the oligarchs, it's also the security structures. Many of those, mainly the FSB, hate China. It's not direct cooperation, so it makes it harder for them.
Oh, great points. And Jiggis, I know you wanted to get in there as well.
I wanted to react really because, you know, some words of Bobo inspired me so much. Well, yes, Putin is looking backwards to the history. Is it Hitler? You know, is it Stalin period? But we know how it ends. It ends ugly, and that's why we have to stop it now, get rid of it. Because if we learned something from Second World War, this is now to act. And then I agree on China. They want this murky, you know, world of appeasement, of autocratic regimes that we've been doing. And that's why I'm pointing to Reagan on my wall. Actually, Barry Jackson gave me that poster. You know, he said in '66, I found it in his museum in LA, that appeasing, well, I think he meant then Soviet Union, it will actually lead to final defeat. So what I'm hinting, so if Russians wants the past, Chinese wants the present, let's create the future together. Reagan had a vision, you know, communists should be ended. Okay, Bush, the father, called it Europe whole and free. You know, Landsbergis, the old one that you see behind me, he also had a vision to destroy the Soviet Union. So let's get rid of Putin and let's create new world. We need to create vision with people like you, Paul, you know, McCain Institute, because you remember well, it was then later on Asmus, Rand Studies, and a lot of other wonderful thinkers, Dan Fried, you know, who helped us to create this world. And I have a strange flag in front of you, Community of Democracies. You know, I was running this organization under the times of Hillary Clinton and so on. Hillary was coming to Vilnius. And again, Mark Palmer, another person on my wall, yeah, let's create this community of democracies, but let's make it strong. Let's create it everywhere, in Indo-Pacific, in our region. Let's fight for Moldovas and Georgias and, you know, everyone who is still fighting for democracy, because we are losing it. For 15 years, read Freedom House, any other reports, you know, we are just losing, we are cornered. American leadership is in threat. You know, they are willing to occupy and annihilate us. We need to create instruments. We need to create United Nations of democracy. We are powerful enough. We have 50% of this world's economy at least. We have brains, we have experience. Let's do it together. New vision for the future of new world where China's and Russia's will stay in the past, and we will create the future.
But let me ask, yeah, go ahead. You have.
And by the way, sorry, for this we need McCain's Institute branch in Vilnius to do it together. Sorry.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Bobo.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. It's often suggested that China should distance itself from Russia, you know, decide where its true interests lie, i.e. in better cooperation with the West, with its neighbors and so on. And all that is undoubtedly true. But there are two major difficulties. One is that one of the rationales of the Sino-Russian relationship, well, from a Russian perspective, it's easy to understand. Having China as a close partner enables Russia to project itself as a global player to an extent that simply would be inconceivable without a partnership with China. But from China's perspective, the motivations are a little bit different. It doesn't really need Russia's active cooperation. It needs Russia not to be a disruptive actor. It needs Russia not to be a pain in the ass, because it looks at how Russia has disrupted Western interests and agendas, and it says, we don't need that. So we have to try, if we want to prosecute Chinese interests, whether it's in Eurasia, the Indo-Pacific, the Arctic, we need a good relationship with Russia. But the other problem is this, a sort of more recent vintage. China can't dump Russia. It can't distance itself from Russia, because where would it go? Because I think there's a real perception in China that regardless of how it behaves, the West, and particularly the United States, will always regard China as the supreme existential long-term challenge, regardless of whether China is ruled by authoritarians, democrats, some hybrid regime or not. So that in a sense, China cannot distance itself from Russia, because it would then be geopolitically isolated. Now, whether you agree with that reasoning, I certainly think it's highly influential in Beijing. The sense that Russia may be let's put it this way, not the ideal strategic partner, but frankly, it's the only strategic partner we have. The alternative is geopolitical isolation, because it's not just that the United States hates us and the Europeans are looking at us with an increasingly jaundiced eye, it's also that we've got rather poor relationships with our most powerful Indo-Pacific neighbors.
We have a few questions from our audience, so I want to open it to that, because I know we're running up against the top of the hour, and I know because you have to get going on the earlier side, so we just want to get to some of our audience questions. And if you have any other questions from from the audience, put them in the Q&A, and we're happy to get them in here. Some of these questions might be just much more targeted to the situation in Ukraine, so just bear with us. From our audience, Sam, he says, I seem to remember there is a small land, Kaliningrad, next to Lithuania. What's the Russian population's take on NATO, on the NATO stance in Ukraine? Also, can Japan and Taiwan be partners of NATO when it comes to defending Chinese and North Korean aggression? So I think that's a kind of a two-part question. Zigis, if you want to take that first part, and then maybe Bobo, this question about sort of the alliance in the Trans-Pacific area and how it would defend Taiwan in case of an attack by China. So Zigis, any comments about Kaliningrad?
Yeah, Kaliningrad related to Ukrainian situation, I would say like this: if we do not stop Putin in Ukraine, if we do not provide what Ukrainians are asking, I am still lobbying for at least partial non-fly zone, for really providing everything Ukrainians ask, because we should understand that if we do not stop, then Putin will continue. Yes, and Kaliningrad is, it's like Moldova or like Crimea. They would love to be territories to be connected. Yes, Suwalki corridor, we are in threat. When Russians are already in Belarus, 30,000 troops, and they are from other side, they can just cut us from the continent. This shouldn't be allowed, and for this, we should kill Putin's regime in Ukraine with every mean we have. Really delivering everything Ukrainians ask, because they fight for survival of liberal democracy on this map, honestly.
Bobo, maybe your thoughts on sort of the, Japan and Taiwan, or Japan and allies in Southeast Asia or Asia, coming to Taiwan's aid if necessary.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that there's a particular NATO connection with Taiwan and Northeast Asia, but that doesn't really matter because Asia has its own US-based security relationships. So the US security partnerships with Japan and South Korea are critically important. So Japan has generally been a very reliable, if somewhat mild-mannered, partner of the United States in relation to China. The complexity, though, comes from that the Japan-China economic relationship is absolutely crucial to both sides. So it's a very, very difficult balance for Japan to achieve. And in a sense, the ambiguity that we complain about in relation to Germany being both a member of NATO, but also being soft, historically soft on Russia, is a little bit of a problem with Japan and China and the United States in Asia. So, but if I personally think that even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that a forcible reunification by Beijing of Taiwan was unlikely. I think it is especially so. I think, frankly, given the difficulties that Russia has had in invading Ukraine, and given how committed the United States has been to what many in America consider to be a peripheral priority, how much more difficult is it going to be in relation to Taiwan, which the United States and its allies consider to be a frontline strategic and normative priority? Plus, let alone the sort of the technical challenges of executing an amphibious landings, and also an issue, Taiwan, which not just Japan, but the United States and many countries around the region considered to be a top line priority. So basically, I would argue if the West can be that united, the West and its partners can be that united on Ukraine, which for many is a peripheral priority, how much more motivated is the United States and its Asian allies are they going to be on Taiwan? But I do think that the Chinese have drawn the lesson that if they are to reunify Taiwan with the mainland, they're going to have to be a lot smarter than Putin has been with Ukraine.
You can say that again. I'm going to combine a couple questions from our audience because I know time is short here, and I want to give each of you some time to give some closing remarks. One question, and it's a serious question about the use of nuclear weapons. How likely would it be if Russia would use them, depending on if the U.S. and its NATO allies do support Ukraine militarily, against Russia, like physically. And then, how far will Putin go if he is successful in Ukraine? I don't think he will be successful in Ukraine. We're showing that there's a lot of weakness from the Russians. But how far, how far will he go? Will he create the Soviet Union again? Zhigis, why don't you take that? And then Jakub, I think, I want to get to another question about, energy independence as well.
Thank you so much, because I think it will be my closing comment, because I have to go to some other meeting. But look, from all our deepest experience, and not only of 30 years, of I would say 1,000 years with the Russians, if they escalate it even more, and they will backtrack, because they know that you might be afraid, and they know that by de-escalation they will get something exactly what they want. That's why I will again repeat that phrase of John Paul II: don't be afraid. Actually, Biden just repeated it in Poland. Escalate, do it, do not fly, at least for humanitarian corridors, at least for those nuclear reactors, at least for those encirculated towns where they're killing thousands of civilians, like in Second World War. Don't you see it? You know, it's outrageous. If we are still human, do what Bush, the president, did in 2008, August 13, when we had 32 planes over Tbilisi. Bush ordered Pentagon to fly in, and what happened? In front of the cameras, Russia withdrew. Do it now, and America can do it. America can save democracy in Ukraine, and you will save democracy on the globe. Thank you, and let's do it together.
Thank you, Zygis, so much for those comments, and your partnership as well. I know you have to run, but we really appreciate everything you're doing in Lithuania and you're doing around the world. So thank you again. We're going to continue with our two other panelists, Jakub and Bobo. I want to give you, maybe Jakub, a chance to address those questions, but also this question, and Bobo, maybe you as well. This question that we had from one of our viewers from Germany, just the overall dependence, energy dependence on Russian natural gas and oil by Europe. And how do we, also the United States in many ways, extract ourselves from, whether it's energy independence, technological independence from China as well, but maybe some of the other issues as well. So Jakub, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Our main problem, at least in Europe, is that when we talk about specific economic or more explicit energy dependencies, is that the perception is sometimes much bigger than the reality. And that comes to European economic relationship to China quite often, where the main Chinese argument, Chinese government argument to many European capitals is, if you do something on Taiwan, we will punish you and we will kill you economically. That's what they say openly or less openly, but this is one of the main messaging or narratives coming from Chinese government officials to European democracies. And but then you have to look at the reality. And just speaking about China, Czech Republic actually expected a major Chinese retaliation for some of the Czech politicians' visit to Taiwan, for example, a couple of years ago. In reality, nothing really happened. Just Chinese political statements, some ugly rhetoric, but freezing of a very, very, very minor contract for one specific company of Czech Republic in China. Nothing really happened after some times. The thing compared to Lithuania is that Lithuania is under Chinese pressure. But if you look over the real numbers, the impact on the Lithuanian economy or its overall exports is like very, 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 very limited. In not even in single digits of percent. It's like even smaller than that. And that's something what actually shows you the reality of let's say the pretending of how much Europe really is economically dependent, specific countries on China and which are not. The problem is that we don't have collective economic defense. We do have military collective defense with NATO within European countries, and that's why Russia does not attack the Baltics, at least until now. But on the economic front, we see that basically Lithuania was left alone after it was pressured by China. There were nice statements, but there was very little or almost no action, which would actually force the Chinese leadership to stop blackmailing European internal market. It's not only Lithuania, there are other companies which are being pressured from Europe by China, but this has not happened. And the reason for it is that the German and French political leaders basically said, no, we are not going to do this. We are not going to pressure the Chinese leaders. We will just keep it at public statements. That's where we are. And that's what needs to change, because we see the big game, I mean, obviously now on Ukraine, and then at least we have good actions by European countries doing, but on China, we are not at the same time of understanding or willingness to commit and struggle to some extent or damage some or share some damage, share some pain, because there is a bigger reason for it. And that's what we need to unfortunately learn, because the world we are going to with China and with Russia, there will be pain, and the only question is how much, whether we will be able to do it collectively, share some relatively small pain together, or individual countries will be really, really hurt. I think that's the main question for us for going forward.
Yeah. But did you want to comment?
Yes, very much so. So on energy dependence, it's quite striking that maybe it's not the most popular opinion here, but the EU could actually learn something from the Chinese in how to address the problem of energy dependence and independence. See, I remember back in 2006, energy imports, gas pipeline was interrupted for a couple of weeks. And I remember so that's 16 years ago, people were talking about the need to be less dependent on Russian energy. Did they do anything about it? Not at all. They went in the reverse direction. A country like Germany became much more energy dependent than it was even then. So I think Europeans have to get serious. You can't just talk about, energy diversity, blah, 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 and not take meaningful steps. Whereas the Chinese, for all their many sins and shortcomings, have pursued a rigorous policy of energy diversification, both in terms of suppliers of oil and gas, but also in types of energy. One of the reasons the Chinese push renewables is not just because they want a nice, clean planet. It's also because they identify this as a source of energy security and indeed an area where they perhaps have growing comparative advantages. So this is, we need to get serious. Now, just on the general thing because I wanted to pick up a point that Zigis had made on concessions. We need to understand that the Chinese also, they view concessions as weakness. Because if you sort of say, well, we need to lower the temperature, we need to understand their so-called legitimate interests. Do we ever? The thing is, we need to understand that what seems from our perspective to be a reasonable concession is seen by them as weakness, and it only encourages them to push harder because they'll take the fairly logical view that, hey, it worked, so let's keep pushing. And finally, just picking up Jakub's point, we need to, when we deal with countries like China and Russia, we need to identify what really are our strategic interests, to what extent are we prepared to defend them, and we also, as Jakub emphasized, we need to understand there will be costs. There's no such thing as a cost-free victory. But if the objective is important enough, our interests are important enough, then the costs ultimately will be bearable. Indeed, to go the other way is a sure route to defeat.
Thank you, you both. And I just want to just give you both sort of the opportunity to, give some closing remarks. We're at 12:10 Eastern Standard Time. Some recommendations, especially as we are witnessing a war right in front of us. And as Zigis said, we are witnessing the death of thousands of Ukrainians at the hands of Putin. And I'd love your comments to include something that, that involves, what NATO can continue to do to support, Ukraine, but also to strengthen the unity of NATO that we haven't seen in decades. So with that, I'd love to just get your final thoughts, and then we'll close it. Jakub, do you want to start us off, and then?
I'll start. I need to run then as well. I think basically now we are really at the moment of looking at ourselves at the mirror, like at least on Ukraine in Europe, and that means that shows us the pains we have of not all the allies in Europe really committing themselves in supporting what's happening in Ukraine or on blocking some of the other sanctions on Russia. So our discussions among the allies, maybe private discussions, will need to be stronger or harder sometimes because we see the cost of it. Because I'm afraid we need to conclude that at least that Russia saw weakness in Europe, at least in recent years. They saw appeasement coming from many European capitals, and overall Russia thought, well, if we invade Ukraine, there will not be a major cost for us. Obviously, they miscalculated, but we clearly sent many signals from Europe to European countries, capitals, to Russia. your invasion of Ukraine will not be that painful to you. We now hope, now I think we underestimated ourselves, so it's going fine, but this is exactly what needs to be happening. And I have to apologize, I need to run too as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jakub. And then Bobo, you get the last word.
Okay, just very quickly, I think we need to focus also on our own game. It's quite easy to criticize the failings of others, be it Russia, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia. But if we don't get our own act together, if we don't improve the level of domestic governance, our commitment to liberal values, norms, and institutions in our own country, how on earth can we expect other countries to take us seriously? Because not only will they not follow, they will utterly disrespect us. And I also wanted another recommendation I would have is that we use lots of terms like right side of history, rules-based international order. Now that's all very nice, but we need to sort of focus on specifics. I mean, general motherhood statements and bromides cut no ice. We really have to focus on the concrete if we are ultimately to show that our system isn't merely virtuous, but it's also more effective than any of the alternatives out there.
You couldn't have said it better. You know, getting our own house in order, whether it's in the United States and other countries around the world, we have to show the world that, you know, democracy delivers at the end of the day, that, you know, freedom delivers, you know, capitalism and free markets, you know, are positive actors in this world. And, you know, it's too important to lose, as we're seeing. You know, I think Ukraine, you know, President Zelensky and, you know, all these Ukrainians are showing what they're fighting for physically. They're not just, you know, fighting for their country, they're fighting for democracy around the world. I truly believe that. I think John McCain would have believed that, you know, Ukrainians are doing this for the rest of the world. And we need to support them in any way possible. So thank you, Bobo. Thank you, Jakub, and thank you, Zigis, for joining us today for this great discussion on China and the future of NATO's relationship, and also you know, the way that's headed. I do have to thank the U.S. NATO mission for making this conversation series possible. And, you know, once again, thank you to our audience for joining us and participating. Sorry, I couldn't get to all your questions, but again, thank you, and have a great day, everyone. And thank you, Bobo, for sticking around.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye now.